Good evening, everyone. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider with you on this 29th of October. As always, we encourage you to stay up to date with your local weather information. No matter what part of Alaska you're watching from tonight, welcome, and make sure you've got this number, 1-800-472-0391. That, of course, is the Alaska Weather Information Line that we tell you about every single night. With that, you can get your local forecast information. Write down the numbers if it's your first time calling in, and you can get to your forecast a whole lot faster the next time. Of course, we do have low bandwidth options online, mobile.weather.gov. Load that up. It is a web page, but type in your location at the top, hit go. It will save a list of up to 10 locations on your phone there, and then save that to your home screen. It will act just like your own personal weather app for Alaska. Mobile.weather.gov is a very easy way to get your local forecast information. No matter how low your signal is, that loads a lot faster than this guy here, weather.gov/Alaska. That's great if you're on the PC and on broadband. It is a hefty website, but a whole lot more information is there 24 hours a day, of course. And if none of that suits your needs, let me know. I'm happy to help serve you any way I possibly can. David.Snider@NOAA.gov is how you find me. Let's take a look at the warnings, watches, and advisories around the region. Thankfully, just advisories tonight. However, they are important advisories. Looks like we could have some high surf, maybe even some storm surge into northern parts of Alaska around Point Barrow and the northern Arctic coast, 4 to 6 feet above normal high tide with the strong southeasterly winds moving through. Again, looks like a high surf advisory is in effect for the northern Arctic coast through early tomorrow. Winter weather advisory is posted for the upper Kobuk and Noatak Valley, as well as the southeastern Brooks Range for about 2 to 4 inches of snow, maybe as much as 6 in a few spots. Most of those areas are seeing snow now, and that should continue until tomorrow morning. And also looking for some strong gusts across the eastern Alaska Range and the Deltana and Tanana Flats region, including our mountain passes. Could see gusts there up to 50, maybe 55 miles per hour through tonight and into early tomorrow morning before that starts to settle down. So snow in the Brooks Range and the upper Kobuk and Noatak, strong surf and probably some higher storm surge areas there at 4 to 6 feet above normal high tide, and strong winds in the eastern Alaska Range. Now, as we look at the satellite picture across the region, pretty easy to see for me, trained eye, looking at low pressure here across the west. But this whole active system here continues to pull up a lot of moisture working its way in from southwest into the interior and working northward. A broad area of low pressure here across the Chukchi, a really strong system for the open waters there. Not a whole lot of ice right now, and even if there was, that probably would be getting chewed up thanks to the strong winds blowing into the system along the Beaufort Seacoast, where we have had some minor collections of ice along the coast. This is not a good situation to keep that ice going. In the meantime, small craft advisories across the outer coast of southeast. We expect to see this moisture working from south to north as a weather front is working its way eastward here. You can see a very sharp defined line working across the eastern Gulf. That is a front, and as that moves eastward, it will take the rain with it. Out across the west, a lot of low clouds. You can see kind of this hazy, murky color here across the Bering Sea, and then out across the west, the next weather system's already working its way in. High pressure sitting across the western Bering at 1,016 millibars, 1020 out across eastern Asia right now. Pretty strong front working its way across the west. Low pressure here sitting across the YK Delta, 1,000 millibars there. The powerful low that's really driving this is at 981. Again, over the open waters of the Chukchi. So a lot of water to work with and a lot of cold air coming in behind that. As that's working across the interior, it will spread rain across south and west, across south central. There is snow falling across the Alaska Range, and there is snow falling across the Brooks Range and again the Kobuk and Noatak Valleys. Out across southeast, rain's moving in. That will spread eastward as we go into tonight. Rain continues across the northern Gulf and southwest around the Cook Inlet region. Most of the Cook Inlet areas, especially from Kenai, Anchorage, all the way up into the Susitna Valley, will likely see a drier period than what we'll see off to our west and to our east. Looking northward, periods of rain and snow will start to fall across the interior. As temperatures drop, that could make roads slick. So if you're driving through the Tanana Valley, if you're driving south along the parks, watch the weather and be careful about the temperature changes as we go ahead. Out across the west, snow will continue to fly in across the Chukchi Coast. And once again, there will be plenty of wind there. A look to the south also shows wind wrapping into a stronger area of low pressure working in from the North Pacific at 989 millibars. That is rising to 992 as we go into Wednesday, so it should be weakening, but we still may have some stronger gusts working across the southern Bering and the Aleutians as well as the Alaska Peninsula. Probably nothing worse than a gale. Periods of rain and snow showers will continue around south central, but for interior locations, especially away from the coast, that's likely going to be snow as temperatures drop. A cold front working across the Alcan border will allow periods of rain and snow to mix immediately behind the front. That could include the middle Tanana Valley once again. Areas of light rain showers across southeast, fairly tame weather considering weather of late. And low pressure across the Arctic coast working its way through the Brooks Range, and as that drops to about 990 millibars, we'll still see some gusty onshore winds for the Chukchi coast, and again that could include the northern Arctic coast. Low pressure on Thursday works into the southern Bering at 994 millibars, pushing a front into the Kenai Peninsula over Kodiak Island into southwest, and starts to approach the eastern parts of the Gulf and the outer coast of southeast. We'll continue to see rain moving ashore, snow showers across the higher terrain, snow develops in the western Alaska Range, and again winds will be picking up across the southern Bering and into Bristol Bay. High pressure sits across the northern interior with periods of snow showers continuing from the northern Arctic coast. Winds should start to diminish as we go into Wednesday night and Thursday for your area. Looking at temperatures across the northwest, it's going to be the coldest there around Ambler and Bettles, lower to mid-20s, probably well below freezing for the Arctic coast. Southeast, not the case at all. 30s and 40s for you. Southwest and south central in the upper 30s and lower 40s. Kodiak about 39. Dutch Harbor and Unalaska 42. 31 in St. Paul. Looks like Nome about 19. A high of 29 tomorrow. 34 for around areas around Utqiagvik. Upper 40s to about 50 for many in southeast. Looks like south central temperatures could hold in the mid to upper 40s again tomorrow. 43 in Talkeetna, 32 for Fort Yukon, Fairbanks 36, Adak 45. Overnight lows on Thursday, still very cold in the interior, 5 for Arctic Village, 12 by the next day.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
And on to flying weather now. IFR concerns will linger across the south-facing slopes of the Brooks Range up to the Chukchi coast and also the northern coast of Kotzebue Sound, wrapping around remainders of low pressure across south central and into the outer coast of southeast. We expect IFR there and MVFR for the inside passage on Wednesday morning. IFR concerns will linger across the eastern chain as well as we start up your Wednesday, with MVFR spreading out a little bit further east out past the Shumagon Islands and approaching the southwestern islands of the Kodiak Archipelago, as well as areas to the west there around the central chain and even further west with the next weather system moving in. You can see on Wednesday morning IFR is building in a little bit more in the afternoon across southern parts of the Bering, across more sections of central and eastern areas around the Aleutians. Still lurking in the central Gulf, but improvements expected across the northern Gulf Coast. Most of the inside passage remains at MVFR for southeast and will linger with IFR around Prince William Sound, the Kenai Fjords, and just about out toward the eastern parts of the Barren Islands. For south central, the Copper River Valley, and really a large part of the Susitna Valley, watch for marginal concerns there with IFR across some of your northern Alaska Range passes. Eastern areas of the Brooks Range also expected to see IFR with widespread marginal conditions across most of the northwest and the Kobuk and the Koyukuk valleys continuing into the afternoon. You'll see a little bit of improvement there Thursday morning down the Koyukuk and into the lower and middle Yukon valleys. The upper end of the Yukon Valley also looking to be generally VFR. IFR moves back into southern parts of southeast across the central and southern parts of the outer coast, with concerns ramping back into IFR conditions for the Barren Islands, Kodiak, as well as areas around the central chain and just south of the Pribilofs there. You can see MVFR slowly lifting in by Thursday morning. Most of the Yukon Valley looks to be VFR. IFR concerns will continue for Wainwright all the way out toward Utqiagvik and parts toward Prudhoe Bay and Dead Horse, it looks like, with marginal conditions through most of the Brooks Range passes. For Thursday afternoon then, IFR conditions expected across the Beaufort, but not really touching any of the coastline there. Marginal conditions will be expected from Utqiagvik south and west toward Point Hope and Point Lay. IFR conditions there will spread along a frontal boundary, pushing into southwest and through Bristol Bay across the southern end of the Kenai Peninsula into Prince William Sound and just kind of nosing its way into the southern parts of the outer coast, with marginal concerns there across a large part of southeast and around the Alaska Peninsula and the eastern chain. Here's your pass conditions in detail then. Anaktuvik and Adigan Pass, we expect to see an IFR start with some improvement throughout the day toward marginal conditions there. For Wednesday, Lake Clark and Merrill Pass expected to lean over from IFR to MVFR as the day goes on. Rainy Pass also looking at an IFR start for your Wednesday. Windy Pass holds at IFR through most of the day. Isabel Pass probably not much of a change either from IFR levels there throughout your Wednesday morning into the afternoon. Matasta Pass, marginal concerns for you on Wednesday. Tanita Pass looks to hold around IFR through most of the day. Portage Pass, we expect to see IFR throughout all of your Wednesday, and Chilkoot and White Pass right now look to be listed at marginal levels throughout the midweek. As we get into freezing levels now, you can see a lot of the cold air is really holding out across the west of the Bering Sea, the western coast, with levels driving down to about 2,000 feet for the central chain, all the way to about Prudhoe Bay and Dead Horse. And then south of that, a lot of warm air is still hovering across the western Gulf, anywhere from 6,000 to 8,000 feet there, and across southeast levels between about 4,000 and 6,000 feet. Most of the interior east of Fairbanks looking at levels between about 4,000 and 6,000 feet for freezing there tomorrow. Icing potential holding around the isolated moderate level for the north slope and across some parts of the upper end of the Tanana Valley and south central. Those levels around 4,000 to about 5,000 feet, some of that working its way into southeast as well. The levels are a little bit higher here. We did see that there was colder air. However, the moisture needed to make icing any type of threat there is a little bit higher up, between about 5,000 and 9,000 feet. The jet stream right now has a very pronounced trough across the southern Bering and the North Pacific. Levels there running into 90 to 130 knots, and then taking a sharp turn northward into the Alaska Peninsula around 90 knots, and then westerlies pick up again across the Gulf between 60 and 110 knots thanks to high pressure sitting there. At 9,000 feet, you can see that broad and sweeping westerly flow with levels around 20 to 40 knots across the northern interior. A ridge of high pressure across the Gulf with winds around 20 to 30 knots. Westerlies coming ashore into southeast, and 20 to 30 knots there from the south and the east across the Alaska Peninsula, wrapping around a very sharp ridge of high pressure sitting across the eastern Bering. Showing up here at 3,000 feet, 10 to 15 knots wrapping around that for St. Lawrence Island and the Bering Strait communities. South and easterly winds wrapping into the southern Bering, 20 to 35 knots, maybe some stronger gusts there, and a ridge of high pressure across the Gulf. Still working in that westerly flow, 25 to 40 knots for most of the interior. Turbulence concerns will be found across the upper end of the Yukon, across the Brooks Range, and across the Aleutians, generally below 4,000 feet.
Some places on the surface you might have these steep cracks and giant fissures that you would have to be careful not to fall into. In other places you might see towers of ice right next to places that were relatively smooth. You might see places that were dark. Ice there takes the form of rock. It's frozen solid until you dig down into that ocean. So you may see some things that look similar to Earth, but you may see some things that are very different.
That voice you just heard?
I am Morgan Kramer, NASA scientist.
I love it.
That's Morgan. She's probably one of NASA's best spokespeople for exploring our solar system's icy moons.
Europa is a fascinating place. It has this liquid water ocean that's about 3 times the volume of all of Earth's oceans combined. That's a lot of water.
To understand what makes Earth so special, sometimes you need to back up and take in the big picture. Remember, the cryosphere is every place on Earth with frozen water. And water is one of the biggest indicators for life.
Every place, at least so far, that we have found life, we found water along with it.
And so far, Earth is the only planet we know of with life. Although Europa isn't the only icy moon in our solar system, NASA has identified it as one of those places with key astrobiological potential. Morgan is a collaborator on the Mapping Imaging Spectrometer for Europa, an instrument selected for NASA's next mission to Jupiter's icy moon Europa. But she's also more than just a scientist working in a laboratory. She's preparing future NASA missions for success on the surface of alien worlds. This year, Morgan and her colleagues were in the field studying how life colonizes in fresh lava.
Earth, it turns out, has a lot of excellent, what we call analog environments, places that are similar enough to some of these other worlds that we can conduct some tests and we can do some analyses here. Now, they're not perfect, of course. They're not going to be exactly like Europa, but we can still learn a lot by testing in these environments. Some of these places include Antarctica and the Arctic Circle, but there are other places too, Alaska, Greenland, even Iceland. Any place where you have a lot of ice, because guess what the surface of Europa is made of? A lot of ice.
Studying the cryosphere doesn't just have big implications for Earth. It also matters for the frozen worlds in our own cosmic backyard.
if we're able to find life or evidence of past life on a place like Europa, that tells us that not only can life happen in other places, but it's common enough that it happened at least twice in the same tiny solar system. That means that the universe is wide open in terms of how much life we might find, the types of life we might find. It would revolutionize how we see ourselves and the possibilities for contact in the universe. It would be amazing. Oh, it's so exciting.
As it flows down the valleys, it actually carves those valleys out and it makes them deeper. And so it creates these beautiful fjords where the ice flows down, snakes out down to the ocean or to the lakes or further inland. And so that ice is flowing, it's moving. My interest in glaciers comes from the sheer size of these things and how much they're able to change on human timescales. And so the amount of mass and energy being transferred by glaciers around the globe is tremendous. It's an absolutely fascinating thing to study from space.
Mountain glaciers are some of the most charismatic parts of the cryosphere. Some might cling to the edges of cliffs at higher elevations, then lay bare and flat in a broad plain, looking cracked and weathered like elephant skin, before tumbling thousands of feet toward the sea and terminating in a dramatic calving front. They're like motion frozen in time, until they aren't. They tell a story about the distant past and yet are incredibly responsive to the present. You can understand why they'd be captivating to all of us, and especially cryospheric scientists. Meet Alex Gardner, a cryospheric scientist at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, who is going to help break down what a classic West Coast North American glacier might look like, where high amounts of snow dump onto the mountains.
And at higher elevations, there's melt in summer, but not enough melt to get rid of all of that snow. And so that snow accumulates, it compacts, it turns into ice, and it starts to flow under its own weight, and it flows down the valleys. And as it flows down the valleys, it actually carves those valleys out and it makes them deeper. And so it creates these beautiful fjords where the ice flows down, snakes out and down to the ocean or to the lakes or further inland. And so that ice is flowing, it's moving.
Alex uses satellite data to study large-scale changes in glacial ice. But 2,000 miles to the north, Chris Larson from the University of Alaska Fairbanks spends a lot of time studying glaciers from the air. He's been flying over Alaskan mountain glaciers for many years, most recently on a NASA-funded mission called Operation Icebridge Alaska. He's absolutely enamored with his local rivers of ice.
And what do you love about mountain glaciers?
Well, they're in mountains, so they're really pretty.
You couldn't ask for a better way to experience Alaska on a large scale than to go flying around for campaign after campaign and look at all of the mountains in Alaska. Truly infinite. You just feel like you'll never see the end of them and don't want to either.
But Chris doesn't spend weeks away from home and family for the views. Chris and his colleagues at NASA want to answer some pretty big questions by learning more about Alaskan glaciers and how they tick.
You know, why does NASA care about these? Well, they actually disproportionately contribute a large amount to sea level rise.
In the long run, as the Earth warms due to climate change, the big ice sheets and mighty outlet glaciers of Greenland and Antarctica stand to contribute the most to sea level rise, simply because the vast majority of the planet's ice is stored there. But currently, it's the world's smaller mountain glaciers in comparatively warmer places like Alaska and Patagonia that are contributing about a third of all inputs to sea level rise, even though they account for only 1% of the world's ice.
Mostly due to them being dynamic. They have water at the bed, which allows them to slide fast, and they react quickly to climate change and have higher velocities than their polar counterparts.
Back at JPL, AKwx uses satellite measurements of global ice and computer models to predict ultimately how much sea level rise we might see due to climate change. But in the case of mountain glaciers, we also care about the local impacts of disappearing ice.
When we think of changes in ice sheets, we typically think of just what is the consequence for sea level rise and the future evolution of the ice sheets. But glaciers in other regions, like high mountain Asia, Alaska, the European Alps, these are places where changes in runoff matters to stream flows. In places like high mountain Asia, you have a lot of glaciers that feed the streams that flow down to populated regions. And that runoff becomes significant for water resources, irrigation, and agriculture.
Both Alex and Chris are passionate about understanding how glaciers are changing and what it means for our planet's future. They'll continue to use tools like elevation maps from the ICESat-2 satellite and detailed airborne measurements to monitor changing ice.
By the end of the tunnel, you're about 100 feet underground, and you're surrounded by bones sticking out of the wall from the steppe bison and the mastodons. There's sticks that are 40,000 years old. There's grass that's still green, that's tens of thousands of years old.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
And time for a quick check of the sea ice update. We apologize, we are still having some work done on our sea ice computer output there. So this is what the sea ice program actually looks like on the website there. And we try to make it a little prettier for you, but you're looking at new ice forming here across the eastern Beaufort Sea coast, along the Alcan border and westward, mainly along coastal areas and in the bays. Not a whole lot of new ice here forming yet across the Chukchi or the Beaufort Seas out in the open water. The main ice pack remains off to the north and east, and a lot of this is forming and gradually drifting to the west there with very low concentrations at this point. Here's a look at the forecast now in southeast. Southeasterly flow around 10 to 20 knots coming up through the inside passage. Southerlies through the Lynn Canal, 20 knots and 4-foot seas there. Light onshore flow right now across the outer coast, 10 to 15 knots and 8-foot seas in general on Wednesday. As we get into Thursday, southerlies pick up a little bit more, 15 to 20. Looking at about 6 to 7 feet across most of the outer coast. On the inside, small seas, light winds there, generally 10 knots and 2-foot seas. Even for the Lynn Canal, 2-foot seas are expected on Thursday. For Wednesday, across Prince William Sound, 10 knots, 2-foot seas. Look for a little bit of a stronger flow coming up Cook Inlet, anywhere from 20 to 25. Anywhere from about 3 to 6-foot seas across Cook Inlet, with a southwesterly flow bringing 15 knots and 7-foot seas up through the Kenai Fjords and Resurrection Bay regions there for Wednesday. For Thursday, a much stronger easterly flow working its way across the northern Gulf, 25 to 35 knots. And 11 to 12-foot seas across the Barren Islands. A northerly wind comes down Cook Inlet, 20 to 30 knots there with 5 to 12-foot seas. Northeasterlies also picking up sharply inside of Prince William Sound, 25 knots and 6-foot seas on Thursday. For Bristol Bay, light winds, seas coming up to about 4 feet, 7 feet down the Bering Sea coast at 30 knots there coming out of the east. South and easterlies coming in from the North Pacific, 25 to 30 with 7 to 13-foot seas developing there, especially south and west of Sand Point to False Pass. Southwesterlies on either side of Kodiak Island, 15 knots and 4 to 7-foot seas there. Coming up sharply to easterly winds at 30 knots with 10-foot seas in Chillicothe Strait, 13-foot seas east of Kodiak Island, and a much stronger southerly flow from Perryville to Sand Point and easterlies on the Bering Sea coast side, 30 knots with 8-foot seas there. 8-foot seas in Bristol Bay with a 35-knot wind on Thursday. For the Aleutians, the strongest winds will be across the eastern chain, coming through the passes there, 35 to 40 knots, maybe some stronger gusts as well. 15 to 16-foot seas there on the Pacific side, and 11 to 14-foot seas on the Bering. Looking for north and easterly winds to diminish as you head westward. 6 to 7-foot seas remain from Adak all the way out towards Shemya, and 6-foot seas expected to hold there as we get into Wednesday, 10 knots and northeasterly flow there from Kiska to Shemya. Look for that to become northerly with time on Thursday. A 6-foot sea there on a 15-knot wind out of the north, and the central and eastern chain looking for some stronger flow between Nikolsky and Atka, about 15 to 30 knots there from the north and east, expecting 10 to 13-foot seas there on the Pacific coast side for your Thursday afternoon. For the west coast, look for a light westerly flow coming into Ammonok and Hooper Bay. Northeasterlies, though, on the south side of that ridge, showing 15 to 20 knots from 4 to 5 foot seas on the either side of Nunivak Island. 7 foot seas around St. Paul and St. George. 25 knots expected there on Wednesday, coming up to 35 knots on Thursday. 13 foot seas there closer to the coast and the mainland. 11 foot seas are expected. Northeasterlies also blowing 15 to 30 north of Nunivak Island into Norton Sound. 3 to 4 foot seas around St. Lawrence Island and into the bay. As you look at Wednesday, a much stronger southerly flow working out of the northern Arctic coast, a much stronger westerly flow coming in. That's all surrounding that very strong area of low pressure across the Chukchi Sea. South and westerlies blowing out of the Beaufort. Looks like we'll see Thursday's weather improving substantially. Winds are still blowing, though, at 25 to 30, looking for 10 to 11 foot seas there along the coast. And once again, a high surf advisory is posted for the northern Arctic coast. That'll last through tonight and into tomorrow there. You're looking at the potential for 4 to 6 foot seas and surf up above the normal high tide there for the northern Arctic coast, which does include Utqiagvik. For the west and southwest, you're looking at 25 knots with 6 to 8 foot seas in the region for your Thursday. Recapping tonight's weather as that weather front moves across the interior and the north. Colder air will flow in fairly quickly. It does look like we'll see accumulating snow around the upper Kobuk and across the southeast. Parts of the Brooks Range there, probably 4 to 6 inches there tops. And it does look like a period of rain and snow will come in behind that, but by Wednesday, the winds will still be working through the northern parts of the Arctic. It does look like the winds will gradually settle out as we get into Wednesday afternoon and early Thursday. Some of that rain and snow could mix around the middle Tanana Valley. If that's falling on warm roads and then melts and then freezes, it could have some slick travel conditions, so be careful about that. Rain will move into southeast, and another weather maker is moving into southwest by Thursday. Thanks for watching. See you again tomorrow.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.